Nobody told you the full story. Trump bombed Iran. The White House said they obliterated the nuclear program. Then the CIA leaked their own report and said something completely different. But here's what no one is telling you. The last 3 times a world leader made this exact call, bombing a rival's nuclear program, claiming total victory, ignoring what the intelligence said. One of them started a war that lasted a decade. One of them is now considered a genius, and one destroyed his own presidency trying to cover up what really happened. Trump just ran the same play. History already tells us exactly which ending we're heading toward. Stay with me, and because the answer isn't what you think. June 22nd. 2025. 7 B-2 stealth bombers, the most expensive warplanes ever built, crossed into Iranian airspace in the dead of night. Beneath the ocean, a U.S. submarine silently fired dozens of Tomahawk cruise missiles, 30,000-pound bunker buster bombs, each heavier than a school bus, punched into the ground above Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan. 25 minutes. That's how long it took. The next morning, Pete Hegseth walked to a podium and said Iran's nuclear ambitions were, his exact word, obliterated. Trump posted on Truth Social, completely and totally obliterated. Now, here's where it gets interesting. 2 days later, the Defense Intelligence Agency, Trump's own military intelligence, quietly leaked their bomb damage assessment. Their findings: Iran's centrifuges, largely intact. Fordow's underground infrastructure, the most hardened, deeply buried site, still operational beneath a collapsed entrance. And the part that should make your stomach drop, some of Iran's enriched uranium had been moved out before the strikes even happened. They knew it was coming. 2 completely different stories. Same bombs, same craters, same 25 minutes. The White House says obliterated. The CIA says delayed. Here's the thing, this exact split, it's happened before. And the last time a president chose the obliterated story over the intelligence report, it didn't end well for anyone. But let's start with the one-time bombing a nuclear program actually worked. June 7th, 1981, Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin does something the world calls insane. He secretly sends 8 F-16s, without telling America, to destroy Saddam Hussein's nuclear reactor in Iraq. 90 seconds. Reactor reduced to rubble. The world erupts. The UN condemns Israel. America calls it a violation of international law. Reagan is furious. Even allies say Begin crossed a line. Then 10 years later, the Gulf War happens. American soldiers discover Iraq has 0 nuclear weapons. None. The program Begin, destroyed, never rebuilt. The same leaders who condemned Osirak quietly changed their minds. Historians now call it one of the most consequential military decisions of the 20th century. Begin is vindicated. A full decade after everyone said he was reckless. This is Trump's best-case scenario. And it's historically real. But, and this is the part that keeps analysts up at night, Osirak worked for one specific reason. Iraq's entire nuclear program was one reactor. Above ground, one location, one clean hit, and it was gone forever. Iran in 2025? Multiple underground sites. Enriched uranium pre-positioned before the strike. Centrifuge components buried in tunnels the bombs physically couldn't reach. The conditions that made Osirak work don't exist here. And when the conditions aren't right, history doesn't give you a vindication story. It gives you something much darker. Here's a fact that should genuinely disturb you regardless of your politics. 1965. LBJ's administration tells the American public that the bombing campaigns in Vietnam are working. Decisive victories. The enemy is weakening. Progress is being made. Meanwhile, classified reports show the opposite. The enemy is adapting. The campaign is failing. Officials know. Historians call this the credibility gap. The distance between what the government says publicly and what the intelligence actually shows. LBJ's presidency didn't collapse because of the war. It collapsed because of the lying about the war. Now read this carefully. The DIA found that Fordow's underground infrastructure survived. Centrifuges largely intact. Uranium pre-positioned elsewhere before the strike. The White House said obliterated. As of early 2026, U.S. intelligence puts Iran still 9 to 12 months from a nuclear weapon. That means the problem is not solved. It's delayed. And here's the psychological trap that makes this genuinely dangerous. No leader ever stands at a podium and says, "The first strike failed, let me reassess." They double down, they escalate. They widen the gap between the story and reality until the gap becomes impossible to close. Vietnam started as an air campaign. Then it needed ground troops. Then more ground troops. Then 58,000 American lives in a decade of escalation before anyone admitted it wasn't working. I'm not saying Iran becomes Vietnam. I'm saying the mechanism that creates Vietnam is already visible. You know what the scariest part of the Vietnam story is? It wasn't that LBJ lied. By the end, he believed his own story. That's the real trap, not malice, momentum. Once you've said obliterated publicly, on Truth Social, on Fox News in front of the entire world, you can't walk it back. The story becomes load-bearing. The policy has to match the words. And that's exactly how America sleepwalked into the longest war in its history. But before you decide where you land on all of this, there's one more thing you need to know. And this one changes the entire moral equation. Iraq, 2003. America invades. The justification? Saddam has weapons of mass destruction. No congressional declaration of war. Allies not pre-notified. Legal authority murky. Maximum urgency used to bypass the normal process. Sound familiar? Trump's Iran strike. No congressional approval. The War Powers Resolution was introduced and defeated. Allies weren't pre-notified. Same murky legal architecture as 2003. Here's the critical difference. And this is where it gets genuinely complicated. Iraq had no WMDs. The intelligence was wrong. Iran had 440 kilograms of 60% highly enriched uranium, verified by international inspectors, documented, real. Enough feedstock for up to 10 nuclear weapons. So the process was identical to Iraq 2003. But the threat was actually real, unlike Iraq. That doesn't make bypassing Congress correct. But it does make the moral calculus harder than either side wants to admit. Here's the actual Iraq lesson that matters. Don't skip the verification steps, because if you're wrong, you can never take it back. And right now, with IAEA inspectors locked out of Iran, the verification is gone. Which brings us to the one piece of this story that almost nobody is covering. Before the strike, the IAEA had confirmed Iran held 440 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium across multiple sites. After the strike, the IAEA lost access. They cannot get inspectors back inside. Read that again. We bombed Iran to prevent them from building nuclear weapons. And now we have less visibility into their nuclear program than we did before we dropped the bombs. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists moved the doomsday clock to 89 seconds to midnight, the closest in its 77-year history. Here's the structural problem. When conventional bombs aren't enough to finish the job underground, and you can no longer verify what the threat level actually is, the logic of escalation doesn't stop on its own. 80 years. That's how long the world has gone without a nuclear weapon being used in conflict. Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, Iraq, Ukraine. Every single time, the bomb stayed in the cabinet. That taboo holds because every leader at every crisis chose not to cross it. Preemptive conventional strikes on nuclear programs create sequels. The sequel's cost depends entirely on what Iran does next in facilities we currently cannot see. History isn't offering one outcome here, it's offering three, and I'm going to tell you which one I think is most likely, and why the other two are still possible. Ending 1. Osirak Vindication. Iran, crushed by sanctions and destabilized by the protests that exploded in late 2025, never rebuilds to weapons grade. The strike is remembered the way Osirak is remembered. Condemned for a year, vindicated for a generation. Trump gets his place in history. This requires Iran to not rebuild in secret. It requires the uranium stockpile to be genuinely inaccessible. It requires the internal protests to keep the regime too distracted to reconstitute. Possible. Not guaranteed. Ending 2. The Iraq spiral. Tactically clean, strategically catastrophic. Iran rebuilds underground in locations no one can monitor. Proxies in Iraq, Yemen, and Lebanon escalate. A second strike becomes necessary, and by early 2026, the US was already reportedly considering ground raids into Isfahan to retrieve enriched uranium from tunnel. That's not a victory lap. That's a war still in progress. The president who ran on ending forever wars becomes the one who started the next one. Ending 3. The Vietnam loop. This is the one I think about most. Not because it's dramatic, and because it's human. Leaders who overclaim early victories cannot afford to admit failure. The story has to keep being, "We're winning," even when the intelligence says otherwise. The gap widens. Trust erodes. By the time the truth is unavoidable, the cost is already catastrophic. Trump's own words, as obliterated, completely and totally destroyed, have already set the rhetorical trap. If Iran proves those words wrong in the next 12 months, someone has to answer for it. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes so consistently you'd think someone was working from a script. Genius or madness? You came here for an answer. Here it is. The strike was necessary. Iran had 440 kilograms of highly enriched uranium and was weeks from weapons capability. The threat was real. Inaction had a cost too, a cost nobody talks about. But the handling of it, the gap between what was claimed publicly and what the intelligence showed, the loss of IAEA verification, the lack of any visible plan for when the first strike wasn't enough, that's where the danger lives. The genius version of the story requires Iran to cooperate with its own defeat. Every historical precedent says that doesn't happen voluntarily. The madness version requires nothing to go wrong. In one of the most volatile regions on Earth, for the next 12 months. We are not in the history books yet. We're still in the chapter being written, and the one thing history tells us with absolute certainty, preemptive strikes don't end the story. They write the next chapter, and the next chapter is always more expensive than the first. The thread to pull right now is the IAEA access crisis, because whatever Iran is doing in those underground facilities we can no longer see, that's where the story goes next. If you have a theory on which ending we're actually in, drop it in the comments. I read everyone. And if you think I got a historical parallel wrong, tell me. The best counter-arguments usually end up in the next video.